The kingdom of Maleko had not always been silent. There was a time when the streets of the capital woke before the sun, when traders unfolded bright fabrics in the market square, and women laughed freely as they bargained over baskets of salt and grain. Drums once echoed from the riverbanks at dusk, and children chased each other through narrow alleys, their giggles rising like birds startled into flight. The palace itself, carved from pale stone and crowned with red banners, had once overlooked a city that breathed in rhythm, music, voices, footsteps, celebration. But now the air felt different. It hung heavy, as though something unseen pressed down upon every rooftop. The market still opened, yet no one spoke above a murmur. Weddings took place without songs. Even the wind seemed to move more carefully, sliding between buildings like a cautious guest. On that morning, when a young merchant forgot himself and let out a brief, startled laugh after dropping a basket of oranges, the sound cut through the square like a blade. Guards turned instantly. The merchant's smile vanished, replaced with dread. Within moments, he was dragged away. No one protested. No one even gasped. The silence swallowed everything. This was the law now. By royal decree, no one in the kingdom was allowed to smile. King Maleko stood at the highest balcony of his palace, looking down at the city he ruled. He was a powerful man, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, always draped in red and gold robes that shimmered beneath the sun. His crown was heavy with hammered gold and polished stones, a symbol of wealth and authority that no one dared question. To an outsider, he appeared unshakable. Yet behind his stern expression lived something far less certain. Maleko had grown increasingly convinced that laughter was not joy, but mockery. Whenever he walked through the streets, he imagined whispers trailing behind him. If someone laughed in the distance, he felt certain it was because of him. When courtiers exchanged quiet smiles during meetings, his heart tightened with suspicion. Years ago, at the beginning of his reign, he had tolerated such things, but over time his tolerance eroded. One memory in particular had lodged itself in his mind like a thorn, a public ceremony during which he had stumbled slightly while mounting his horse. The crowd had reacted, not cruelly, not loudly, but he had heard laughter, or at least he believed he had. The moment replayed in his thoughts again and again, growing sharper with each retelling. In his version of events, the entire square had laughed at him. That day, something shifted inside him. Power, he decided, demanded fear, and fear required silence. The decree banning smiles had been announced in the royal court 3 months earlier. The hall was filled with ministers, generals, and advisors dressed in ceremonial garments, their eyes lowered respectfully as the king spoke. His voice was steady, almost calm. From this day forward, he had declared, laughter within my kingdom will be considered an act of defiance. Smiling in public will be punished. A ruler must be honored, not ridiculed. The words echoed against the carved stone walls. For a brief moment, there had been confusion, a subtle shifting of weight, a flicker of disbelief across a few faces, but no one objected, no one dared. The chief minister, an older man with cautious eyes, had bowed deeply and affirmed the order. Guards were instructed immediately. Town criers carried the message to every district, every village, every corner of the realm. At first, the citizens thought it a misunderstanding. Surely the king did not mean literal smiles. Surely joy itself was not forbidden. But the arrests began swiftly, and doubt disappeared. A farmer was fined for grinning at his newborn daughter. A group of children was scolded harshly for laughing while playing near the wells. Fear spread faster than rumor. People trained their faces into blank masks. They practiced stillness in mirrors. They taught their children to lower their eyes and suppress instinct. Within weeks, the kingdom transformed. It still functioned. Trade continued, soldiers patrolled, taxes were collected, but something essential had been drained away. The city no longer felt alive. It felt obedient. But obedience did not bring peace to King Maleko. Each evening, after the formalities of court concluded, he wandered the corridors of his palace alone. Servants stepped aside silently as he passed, their expressions carefully neutral. Even during meals, no one risked meeting his gaze for too long. He had demanded control, and he had achieved it. No laughter reached his ears anymore. No distant bursts of joy disturbed his thoughts. The city below his balcony remained orderly and quiet, and still he felt restless. At night he lay awake, staring at the carved ceiling above his bed. He told himself that the silence proved his strength. He told himself that respect required discipline. But beneath those justifications, a small unease persisted. Why did the palace halls feel colder? Why did the celebrations honoring his victory seem hollow? Once, during a private banquet, a musician's fingers slipped on the strings of a kora, producing an accidental, cheerful trill. For a heartbeat, the room tensed.
waiting to see how the king would react. Maleko had simply raised his hand and the music stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than before. In that silence, he felt something unfamiliar. Not joy, not satisfaction, but distance. He had removed laughter from his kingdom, yet he could not remove the echo of it from his own memory. The more he silenced his people, the louder his thoughts became. And though he would never admit it aloud, the silence he had created was beginning to feel less like order and more like isolation.
And though he would never admit it aloud, the quiet he had created was beginning to feel less like order and more like isolation. That isolation did not only live inside the palace walls, it stretched outward, settling over the poorest corners of the kingdom as heavily as it did over the royal chambers. In a narrow district near the edge of the city, where clay houses leaned gently against one another and dust rose with every passing cart, lived a boy named Tanu. He had no parents. The neighbor said sickness had taken them when he was too young to remember their faces clearly. What he did remember, however, was warmth. The warmth of his grandmother's voice, the way she would cup his cheeks in her wrinkled hands and tell him that a smile was not weakness, but light. "Never let the world steal this from you," she would whisper, whenever hardship pressed too close. Their home was small, its roof patched with woven reeds, its doorway framed by faded blue paint. Yet, within those humble walls, laughter had once been easy. Even after the decree, when neighbors began practicing solemn expressions in reflective bowls of water, Tano found it difficult to obey fully. Not because he was rebellious, and not because he wished to challenge the king, but because smiling felt as natural to him as breathing. When the baker tripped over a sack of flour and muttered at himself, Tano's lips twitched before he could stop them. When an old woman scolded a goat for eating her laundry, a quiet grin escaped him. Each time he caught himself quickly. Each time he remembered the law. Yet something inside him resisted complete surrender. Tano understood fear. He had seen it settle into the eyes of grown men. He had watched mothers pull their children closer whenever guards passed by in pairs. The soldiers were not cruel without reason. They were simply following orders. But their presence was constant, and their instructions were clear. Faces forward, eyes down, no laughter. The city had become a place of rehearsed stillness. Tano tried to practice it too. He would stand before a cracked mirror and flatten his expression, studying the way his features hardened when he forced himself not to smile. The results disturbed him. Without his usual brightness, his reflection looked older, almost unfamiliar. It was as if someone had dimmed a lantern behind his eyes. He remembered his grandmother's words then. "Smile even when the sky is gray, because your heart must not forget how to be warm." Those lessons had not been taught out of comfort, but out of survival. She had lived through seasons of famine, through storms that destroyed harvests, through years when the kingdom struggled before Maleko's reign brought wealth and expansion. Hardship, she believed, was certain. Joy, however, so small, was a choice. And so Tano chose it quietly, carefully, holding on to it as if it were something fragile, yet sacred. He did not mock the king. He did not speak against the law. He simply refused to let the last ember inside him turn cold. The day everything changed began like any other. Dry heat settling over the market square, merchants arranging goods beneath cloth canopies, the faint scent of spices drifting through the air. Tano had been sent to trade a small bundle of woven bracelets his grandmother had made. He moved through the stalls with cautious steps, offering polite nods, keeping his expression neutral. Business was slow. Customers spoke in subdued tones, and even the animals tethered nearby seemed quieter than usual. Then, near the well, an elderly storyteller, a man known for dramatic gestures and exaggerated expressions, attempted to entertain a small group of children without technically breaking the law. He told his tale in a hushed voice, using only his hands and eyebrows to convey the humor. At one point, he puffed out his cheeks so wildly that a few children covered their mouths to hide their giggles. Tano watched, trying to remain composed. The storyteller crossed his eyes in mock seriousness, and for a split second, Tano forgot the decree. A small, bright laugh slipped out of him. Quick, genuine, impossible to retract. The sound barely rose above a whisper, yet in that tense marketplace, it was as loud as a drumbeat. A guard standing near the spice stall turned sharply. Silence fell with terrifying speed. The storyteller froze. The children scattered. Tano's heart pounded as he realized what he had done. The guard approached slowly, armor clinking softly with each step. His face showed no anger, only duty. "You laughed," he said flatly. It was not a question. Tano swallowed but did not deny it. Around them, merchants stared at their goods, pretending not to watch. No one intervened. Fear had trained them well. The guard grasped Tano's arm firmly, but not violently. "You know the law," he continued. Tano nodded. Yes. The word came out steady, though his chest tightened. He glanced briefly toward the storyteller, who looked stricken with guilt. For a fleeting moment, Tano considered apologizing, pleading, explaining that it had been an accident, but something in him resisted that instinct. If smiling was wrong, then he had been wrong many times before, quietly and unseen. The guard began leading him through the market, past stalls where familiar faces refused to meet his eyes. As they walked, Tano noticed something that surprised him. Beneath the fear, beneath the rigid discipline, he saw longing. People missed laughter. They missed it deeply. The journey to the palace felt longer than usual. The grand gates loomed ahead, carved with symbols of strength and conquest. Tano's steps slowed slightly, yet he did not struggle. His heart trembled, but his lips, despite everything, curved faintly upward, not in defiance, not in mockery, but in quiet acceptance. Inside the palace courtyard, the world felt even colder. Stone pillars cast long shadows across polished floors, and banners fluttered weakly in the afternoon wind. Tano was brought to a waiting chamber, while a messenger informed the king. He sat alone on a wooden bench, hands resting on his knees. Fear settled over him fully now. He was still a boy after all. He thought of his grandmother, of her gentle insistence that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear define you. He wondered whether she would be angry with him for risking punishment. He hoped she would understand. Somewhere above, in a high balcony, King Maleko stood once more overlooking his silent city, unaware that the smallest challenge to his rule was waiting just below. The king believed he had extinguished laughter from his realm. He believed he had secured obedience. Yet in that quiet chamber, in the steady breathing of a boy who refused to let his spirit bend entirely, something fragile but powerful remained alive. And soon, that small, persistent light would stand face to face with the throne itself.
And soon, that small, persistent light would stand face to face with the throne itself. The great doors of the royal court opened slowly, their hinges groaning against the silence that ruled the kingdom. Tano was led inside by two guards whose expressions were carefully empty. The courtroom was vast, supported by towering carved pillars that rose like ancient trees toward the high ceiling. Light filtered in through narrow windows, casting long beams across the polished stone floor. At the far end, elevated above everyone else, sat King Maleko upon his throne, draped in crimson and gold, posture straight, eyes sharp and unreadable. Ministers lined both sides of the hall, hands folded within their robes, avoiding unnecessary movement. The air felt tight, as though even breathing too loudly would be considered rebellion. Tano's footsteps echoed faintly as he approached the center of the chamber. For a brief second, he felt very small beneath the weight of so many watching eyes. Yet, he did not lower his head completely. He bowed respectfully as he had been taught, and then looked up. His heart beat rapidly against his ribs, but somewhere beneath the fear, his quiet resolve remained. King Maleko studied the boy in silence before speaking. "You are the one who laughed in the marketplace," he said at last, his voice deep and controlled. It was not anger that filled the tone, it was authority. Tano nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." A subtle murmur rippled through the ministers, quickly silenced. The king leaned slightly forward. "You know my decree. You know the consequences. Why did you choose to defy it?" The question lingered in the air like a suspended blade. Tano hesitated only long enough to gather courage. "I did not mean to defy you, sir," he answered honestly. "It happened before I could stop it." The king's eyes narrowed. "So, you admit you cannot control yourself?" There was an edge there now, not loud but sharp. Tano swallowed. "I try to control my actions, Your Majesty. But, smiling, it is not always something I choose. Sometimes it simply comes." A few ministers shifted uncomfortably. The king's jaw tightened. Smiling leads to laughter. Laughter leads to mockery. Mockery weakens a kingdom. His voice rose slightly with each sentence. "Order creates strength. Discipline creates respect." Tano listened carefully. Then, with a steadiness that surprised even himself, he replied, "Joy creates life." The words did not challenge the throne aggressively. They simply stood there, calm,
and clear. For the first time, something flickered across the king's face, not fury, but something more complicated. The king rose slowly from his throne, descending the steps that separated him from the boy. The court watched in breathless silence. Life? Maliko repeated quietly. You speak of life as though you understand it. He circled Tano once, studying him. You are a child. You have known hunger, loss. You have nothing, and yet you claim joy is necessary. Tano's hands trembled slightly at his sides, but he did not retreat. Yes, your majesty. I have known hunger. I have known loss. That is why I smile. The king stopped walking. Explain yourself. Tano drew in a slow breath. When my parents died, I thought the world had ended. But my grandmother told me something. She said, pain will always visit, but we do not have to let it stay forever. She said, a smile does not erase suffering, but it reminds us we are still alive. If I stop smiling, then the sadness wins completely. The courtroom felt suddenly smaller, as though the boy's words pressed against its walls. Maleko's gaze hardened again, yet behind it there was a faint tremor. And what of respect? He demanded. What of honor for your king? Tano answered without hesitation. Respect does not grow from fear alone, sir. It grows from knowing the king protects the hearts of his people. The sentence landed heavier than any shout. A sharp inhale passed through one of the ministers, quickly disguised as a cough. For several long moments, no one moved. The king's face became unreadable once more, retreating behind the mask of authority he had perfected. You speak boldly for someone so young, he said at last. Boldness can be mistaken for insolence. Tano bowed his head slightly. I do not wish to insult you, your majesty. I only wish to keep something that belongs to me. The king studied him closely. And what is that? The boy lifted his eyes again. My spirit. The word seemed almost fragile in the vast stone hall, yet it did not break. The king turned away abruptly, ascending the steps back toward his throne. He could feel the court watching him, waiting for his judgment. He could not allow doubt to appear. He could not allow softness to be mistaken for weakness. The law exists for a reason. If one person is permitted to ignore it, others will follow. Discipline must be upheld. His hand tightened around the armrest of his throne. The boy will be imprisoned. The sentence fell like a final hammer strike. Guards stepped forward immediately. Tano felt a wave of cold fear rush through him, but he forced himself to breathe steadily. As the guards gently but firmly placed iron cuffs around his wrists, he did not cry out. He did not plead. Instead, he allowed a small, quiet smile to rest on his face. Not wide, not provocative, just present. The sight unsettled more than one person in the room. Even as he was led away, chains clinking softly with each step, Tano's expression remained calm. The courtroom doors closed behind him with a heavy thud. Inside the chamber, King Maleko remained seated, outwardly composed, yet something within him had shifted slightly. The boy's words echoed in his mind. Joy creates life. Respect grows from protection. My spirit. They were simple statements, yet they lingered stubbornly. Maleko told himself the sentence was necessary. Law without consequence was meaningless. A kingdom could not be ruled by sentiment. And still, as the court was dismissed and the ministers filed out in silence, he found himself staring at the empty space where the boy had stood. Meanwhile, below the palace, in a dim stone cell, lit only by a narrow shaft of light, Tano was placed behind iron bars. The guards locked the door and stepped away. Alone in the quiet darkness, the boy leaned back against the cold wall. His wrists ached from the weight of the cuffs. Fear crept in fully now, pressing against his chest. But after a moment, he exhaled slowly and allowed his lips to curve again. Gently, deliberately, not because he felt brave, not because he felt safe, but because he refused to surrender the last piece of warmth inside him. And far above, though he did not know it yet, the king who had condemned him was already beginning to feel the first cracks in his certainty.
And far above, though he did not yet know it, the king who had condemned him was already beginning to feel the first cracks in his certainty. That evening, King Maleko dismissed his attendants earlier than usual. The palace corridors seemed longer as he walked them alone, the echo of his footsteps following him like an accusation. Torches flickered along the walls, their light stretching shadows that bent and twisted across the carved stone. He paused outside the grand hall, listening. Nothing. No distant music. No servants whispering carelessly. Only controlled, careful silence. This
This was what he had demanded. This was what he had built. Yet instead of satisfaction, a strange hollowness pressed against his ribs. He entered his private chamber and removed his crown slowly, placing it upon a carved wooden stand. Without its weight, his head felt lighter, but not freer. He poured himself water, yet his throat remained dry. When he finally lay down, sleep did not come easily. His thoughts replayed the trial again and again. The boy's steady voice, the absence of pleading, the word spirit. Maleko turned onto his side, closing his eyes tightly, as if darkness might quiet the noise in his mind. Instead, it opened a door. In his dream, he stood alone in the great courtyard of his palace. The sky above was gray and endless, stripped of color. The banners that once fluttered proudly now hung stiff and lifeless. Around him were rows of people, hundreds perhaps, thousands, but none of them had faces. Their heads were smooth and blank, their expressions erased entirely. He tried to speak to them, to command them, but no sound emerged from his mouth. He walked toward his throne, which gleamed brighter than ever before, covered in gold so polished it reflected the empty sky. When he sat upon it, the metal felt cold, painfully cold, as if it had never known warmth. Suddenly, he noticed something strange. His hands were turning gray, stiffening like stone. He raised them to his face and touched his cheeks. They were hard, expressionless, frozen. Panic surged through him. He tried to smile, to prove that he still could, but his lips would not move. The faceless crowd began to fade, dissolving into mist, leaving him alone in a vast, silent emptiness. Then, from somewhere distant yet unmistakable, he heard a voice, soft, familiar. Beta. The word pierced the dream like light through a crack. It was his mother's voice, a voice he had not heard since childhood. Takat se dar milta hai, mohabbat se dua milti hai. Power brings fear, love brings blessing. The words echoed again and again, growing louder until they filled the empty courtyard. Maleko tried to call out to her, but the stone around his mouth would not break. He was trapped within his own expressionless face. He woke abruptly, breath ragged, sheets damp with sweat. The room was dark, except for a faint moonlight slipping through the window. For a moment, he could not move. His heart hammered against his chest, as if trying to escape. He lifted his hand slowly, half expecting to see stone. Flesh met flesh, warm, human. He sat upright, pressing his palms against his face, feeling the curve of his cheeks, the tension in his jaw. The dream clung to him stubbornly. He had not thought of his mother in years. She had been a gentle woman, far softer than his father, who had ruled with rigid discipline. As a boy, Maleko had once returned from the marketplace in tears after hearing other children laugh when he mispronounced a word during his speech practice. He had run to his mother, convinced the laughter meant humiliation. She had knelt before him, holding his face in her hands, and said, "Not every laugh is cruel. Sometimes people laugh because they are happy." But his father had overheard and disagreed sharply. A ruler cannot allow laughter at his expense, the king had declared. It weakens authority. That sentence had carved itself into Maleko's young mind. Now, sitting alone in the darkness of his chamber, he realized how deeply he had allowed that belief to guide him. He rose from his bed and began walking through the palace corridors again, this time not as a ruler inspecting his domain, but as a man searching for something he could not name. The torches burned low. Servants slept behind closed doors. Even the night air felt distant. He stopped at a window overlooking the city. From this height, the rooftops looked peaceful, but he knew the peace was artificial, enforced, not earned. He wondered suddenly whether his people dreamed of him with fear. Before dawn had fully broken, Maleko made a decision he did not announce to anyone. He dressed simply, without ceremonial robes, and walked toward the lower levels of the palace where the prison cells were kept. The guards stationed outside the corridor straightened immediately, startled to see the king without warning. He gestured for silence and approached the final cell at the end of the hall. Inside, sitting against the cold stone wall, was Tano. A thin beam of early morning light slipped through the small barred window, resting across the boy's face. His wrists were still bound, yet his posture was upright. He looked tired, but not defeated. When he noticed the king, he slowly stood. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt different from the silence of the courtroom, less rigid, more uncertain. "Are you not afraid?" Maleko asked, his voice lower than before. Tano considered the question honestly. "I am, but fear should not decide who I am." The simplicity of the answer unsettled the king more than defiance would have. "You sit in chains, and still you smile." Tano glanced down at his bound hands and then back up. "If I stop smiling because I am afraid, then the chains are stronger than me." The words lingered in the narrow corridor. Maleko felt something shift again inside his chest, not the sharp crack of anger, but the slow, uncomfortable opening of realization. For the first time, he saw not a threat to his authority, but a reflection of something he had lost long ago. He had tried to silence laughter to protect himself from imagined mockery, yet in doing so, he had imprisoned more than his people. He had imprisoned his own humanity, and standing there, in the dim light of the prison corridor, the king understood that the law he had created was not a shield, it was a wall, and that wall was beginning to crumble from within.
And that wall was beginning to crumble from within. King Maleko stood in the narrow prison corridor longer than he realized, staring at the boy who had somehow unsettled an entire throne. The torches along the stone walls flickered softly, and in their unsteady glow, the king saw something he had not allowed himself to see before. Not weakness, not rebellion, but courage, untouched by bitterness. He turned to the guards slowly. His voice, when it came, was not loud, yet it carried a weight none dared question. "Remove the chains." The guards hesitated only for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. Iron clasps were unlocked. Metal fell away. Tano rubbed his wrists gently, surprised but silent. Maleko did not offer explanation immediately. Instead, he studied the boy one last time and said, almost quietly, "Walk with me." Together they moved through the awakening palace, past servants who froze in disbelief at the sight. Words spread ahead of them like wind through dry grass. By the time they reached the great balcony overlooking the city, ministers had gathered nervously behind the king, unsure of what was about to unfold. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting warm gold across rooftops and market stalls below. The city stirred as usual, careful, subdued, restrained. Maleko stepped forward to the edge of the balcony. For a moment, his old instinct urged him to maintain authority, to protect his pride. But the dream, his mother's voice, and the steady gaze of the boy beside him pressed against that instinct until it gave way. He raised his hand. The murmurs below quieted completely. "People of my kingdom," he began, and his voice echoed across the square. "I believed that silence would protect strength. I believed that fear would secure respect." He paused, feeling the weight of every eye. "I was wrong." The words seemed to hang in the air, almost unreal. Ministers shifted uncomfortably. The crowd below remained frozen. Maleko continued, more firmly now. "From this moment forward, the decree is lifted. Smiles are not forbidden. Laughter is not rebellion. It is life." Silence held for a heartbeat longer, fragile and uncertain. Then, somewhere near the fountain in the square, a small child laughed. A quick, nervous sound. A mother gasped softly, but the guards did not move. Another laugh followed, slightly louder. Within seconds, the sound began to spread. Hesitant at first, then gathering confidence, it rolled across the square like rain after a long drought. Faces lifted, shoulders relaxed, some wept openly. The city breathed again. Tano stood beside the king, watching the transformation unfold. He did not cheer or raise his arms, he simply smiled, the same quiet, steady smile that had carried him through fear. Maleko glanced at him briefly, as if acknowledging the source of the shift without announcing it aloud. The ministers behind them were still stunned. One stepped forward cautiously. "Your Majesty, shall we issue a formal statement?" Maleko shook his head. "The people have heard me." He looked out over the square again. Musicians, unsure but hopeful, began to test their instruments. A drumbeat sounded, soft at first, then stronger. Merchants who once spoke in whispers now greeted customers with warmth. Children ran in open circles, laughter ringing freely against the palace walls. The change was not forced. It blossomed naturally, as if joy had been waiting just beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, Maleko walked through the marketplace without ceremony. No armored procession, no raised platform, just a man moving among his people. They parted respectfully, but their eyes were different now, not empty, not fearful, but alive. Some smiled at him cautiously, as if testing whether the permission was truly real. Maleko found himself doing something he had not done in years. He returned the smile. It felt awkward at first, unfamiliar, as though muscles long unused were remembering their purpose. Yet with each exchange, the tension inside him loosened. He stopped at a stall where an old storyteller gestured animatedly, this time without restraint. The man froze briefly when he noticed the king, but Maleko simply nodded for him to continue. Laughter rose naturally around them, and for once, the king did not search for hidden insult within it. He listened, he observed, and slowly he understood that laughter was not a weapon aimed at him, it was a bridge between people. As evening settled over the kingdom, golden light washed across the palace once more. From the same balcony where silence had once ruled, King Maleko and Tano stood side by side. Below them, the city shimmered with renewed energy. Music drifted upward. Lanterns glowed warmly along the streets. The air carried the unmistakable rhythm of celebration, not forced, not exaggerated, but genuine. Maleko rested his hands on the stone railing, reflecting on how close he had come to turning his kingdom into a monument of cold obedience. "He taught me something I had forgotten," he said quietly, not looking at the boy. Tano tilted his head slightly. "What is that, Your Majesty?" The king exhaled slowly. "That ruling a kingdom and being human are not the same thing." He paused, then added, "And that I must be both." Tano's smile deepened, gentle but proud. "Then the kingdom is strong," he replied simply. Maleko allowed himself a small, honest laugh. Not loud, not grand, but real. In that sound, there was no insecurity, no imagined mockery, only release. The city below continued to pulse with life, unaware that its greatest transformation had not been the lifting of a decree, but the healing of a wounded heart. Power had once built walls around King Maleko. Fear had convinced him that control was protection. Yet a single boy, armed with nothing but courage and a smile, had shown him a different truth, that strength without compassion is brittle, and authority without humanity is hollow. As night fully embraced the kingdom and laughter echoed freely beneath the stars, Maleko understood that he had not lost power by admitting his mistake. He had gained something far greater. And from that day forward, the story of the king who banned smiles became something else entirely. The story of the king who learned how to smile again.